What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here to talk to you about Titus Awakes, the fourth book in the Gormenghast trilogy. The Gormenghast trilogy started with Titus Grown in, I believe, 1949, and the last one, Titus Alone, came out in, I believe, 1958 or 59. I don't remember the exact year. And then Mervyn Peake died about 10 years later in the late 60s. And then a couple years after that, Maeve Gilmore, his widow, began writing what eventually became this story. And according to a foreword at the very beginning by Brian Sibley, Maeve Gilmore did not intend for this to be published. So it's going to be really weird for me to talk about this book and level any criticisms against it, since she never meant for it to see the light of day. According to Brian Sibley, this was basically just a cathartic way for Maeve Gilmore to mourn her husband and the loss of his life. I don't know how he knows that. I don't know if Brian Sibley was a lifelong friend of Mervyn Peake and Maeve Gilmore, or if he was just an editor that Maeve Gilmore's granddaughter, Kristen, I think, or Christina, she found this manuscript like 25 years after Maeve Gilmore wrote it, and then gave it to Brian Sibley. So I have no idea how much he actually knew Mervyn Peake and Maeve Gilmore, or if he knew them at all. But a lot of the foreword of this book is him kind of talking about, I don't know if psychology is the right word, but kind of some of the behind-the-scenes action with this book, talking about how Maeve Gilmore was putting some closure on the world that Mervyn Peake had created and the characters, and talking about how some of the characters in this book represent aspects of Mervyn Peake's life. And again, I don't know how much of that is he knew Mervyn Peake and Maeve Gilmore very well, or if he's just making some really educated guesses. Some of what he says is pretty obvious when you read the book, like, oh, okay, Titus at one point meets an artist who is going through some mental troubles, and then later he meets this artist again, and everything seems fine, and the artist, it seems like, okay, maybe that's a stand-in for Mervyn Peake, kind of like how I said in Titus Alone, it seemed like Titus thinking that he was losing his mind, that maybe that was a little bit of Mervyn Peake putting himself into the character of Titus. This seems like Maeve Gilmore is putting Mervyn Peake as a character in a story, and especially when you get to the very end, it seems like that's what's going on. But like I said, this was never meant to be published, and it was only long after Maeve Gilmore's death, she died in the early 80s, that her granddaughter found it, and then it was published. And so anything that I say, anything negative that I say about this, like I say, it's going to be really difficult for me to actually be blunt about it, because she never meant for it to be seen by me. That would be like if I wrote in my very private diary something, and then, 40 years from now, somebody's looking at my diary and maybe I'm misspelling words, or I'm not putting a comma here, or dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, and then somebody is like, oh, this is awful, I can't believe someone wrote this, when I never meant for anyone to look at it. But people did look at it. Somebody published it. And I'm not really sure if this was a situation where Maeve Gilmore's granddaughter... I keep saying Maeve Gilmore because I'm not sure if Maeve Gilmore had kids with Mervyn Peake. I'd have to re-look at the foreword, and I'm not going to do that. But anyway, if the granddaughter... If this was like, okay, we're going to make money now from this, or if this was done with more artistic ambitions. The Titus trilogy, that was concluded a long time ago, and now there are people out there who would like to see Maeve Gilmore's attempt to kind of put some closure on that whole trilogy. And I will say, if I had never read the Titus trilogy, or the Gormenghast trilogy, and then I started reading this, I don't know if I would have been able to have finished it. I think a lot of what kept me going with this was that I had already fallen in love with this world and with the characters. Really, it's just Titus is the only recurring character from the original trilogy. But if I didn't have all of that already behind me, reading Titus Grown, Gormenghast, and Titus Alone, then I don't know if I would have wanted to have have kept reading once I got into this. I will say it feels very different from Mervyn Peake's work. If you were one of the people that did not like Titus Alone, if you didn't like that Mervyn Peake introduced all of this technology stuff into it, like there's automobiles and there's a factory and these floating glass orbs, if you don't like any of that, you may not like Titus Awakes, because there's even more of that. Once again, there's automobiles. At one point they mention telephones. There's boats that he's getting on, and it seems very 20th century. None of it feels any way like Titus Groan or Gormenghast, that felt like it happened in some vague time period that felt very Victorian. This does not in any way feel like that. This feels very modern, and I was willing to give Titus Alone a little bit of a pass. Like I said, Mervyn Peake was inventing a new genre, I felt like. So I was okay with him saying Gormenghast is some, like, undiscovered part of the world where Titus grew up and technology is further behind, and then he's able to escape and he gets out into the rest of the world, and then it's much closer to the present day. I'm okay with that. But then when you get to this book, and it doesn't have any connection with the earlier books, I felt like at least Titus Alone, it felt like there was a deliberate moving toward closer technology closer to what existed at that time, whereas this just feels like a story that takes place in the 1970s. And I don't know. I don't know why I was more okay with Titus Alone than I am with this. I don't know how to put it into words. At one point, it mentions that Titus sees a halo of light, and it mentions specifically an Italian baby Jesus. I have no idea how an Italian baby Jesus is different than any other baby Jesus, but specifically it mentions, like, a product that you can buy, like, you know, you buy a manger set, like at Kmart, and it mentions a product that you can buy, and in Italy, whereas Gormenghast Mountain is not a real place. And then all the different locations that Titus goes in Titus Alone, they're not real places, but then this is now mentioning Italy, and that is a real place. And it's just weird. I feel like now I'm catching up with where everyone else was at with Titus Alone. Everyone who is like, we hate this, we don't like all this modern technology and sci-fi technology in Titus Alone, I'm starting to feel it as well with Titus Awakes. And really, if you change the name of this character in this book, most of this would not feel like it is the same world. I will say Titus does feel pretty consistent with how he was portrayed in Titus Alone. He's a little bit of a snot-nosed punk. He's not a very nice guy. He goes around, he is a horn dog, sleeps with just about every woman that he meets, and he doesn't exactly, he sleeps with most of the women that he meets in this book, but this is very consistent with how he was portrayed in Titus Alone. The difference between Titus Alone and this book, what I liked about Titus Alone, is that it was pretty episodic. Titus, he meets this woman in this town, and then he meets this guy, and then he leaves this town, goes to another town, but then his adventure in the first town, it kind of comes back and ties in with what he's doing in the second town. That's Titus Alone. And I felt like even though Titus is now, as a young adult in Titus Alone, he is fully portrayed as someone who he is on the search for something. He doesn't know what he's on the search for, but he can't just stay in one place. So you're not going to have one singular location like you did with the first two books. And that continues with this book. Unfortunately, there is very little that connects the various episodes in this book. This is 265 pages long. It's not very long, really. The font and the spacing is pretty big. So I would say, comparatively, it's actually probably shorter than Titus Alone, which was under 200 pages. But anyway, there's like 5 or 6 different little individual episodes that Titus goes on throughout this book, and there's very little that connects any of it. At one point early on, Titus, he is in this place where there's these people. They don't speak the same language that he speaks, and then he ends up knocking a girl up, and then he leaves, and there's this dog that follows him, and then he meets this husband and wife, and then he tells them a little bit about himself, and then he leaves, and then these soldiers kind of sort of kidnap him. At one point, we are in the dog's point of view, and the dog knows that the soldiers are not exactly friends and not exactly enemies, which is weird, because when Titus wakes up, he knows that the soldiers want to use him as a decoy for something, and then we never find out what they want to use him for, and then he has some help. He escapes from there. Then he meets this artist, this lady artist, and then he stays with her a little bit, and then he leaves, and then eventually he goes and he works at a mental institution, and that's where he meets the guy who is basically Mervyn Peake. He's one of the patients there. At one point, there are these teenagers wearing masks, and they call themselves the Destructionists, and they say, any personal belongings that you have, we want them, and we want to destroy them. Then he gets away from them, and then he accidentally walks into a wake. Someone had died, and then he basically kind of gets kidnapped by someone. This was actually a little weird. I'll spend a little bit more time talking about this. It introduces a guy. Titus is just walking down the road, and then this car pulls up and rolls down the window, and you hear someone inside say, hey, can I give you a lift? And the text says this person had neither a masculine nor feminine voice, so you can't really tell if it's a man or a woman. And then it turns out it is a guy, and then he's portly, he dresses with style, and he fancies himself a poet. The laddie fancies himself a poet, to quote a wise man. And he basically insists, you're coming with me, I need somebody to listen to me read my poetry. And then they go to his fancy mansion, where there's a whole bunch of other people there, and then something happens, and he comes in and he starts yelling at all his guests, and then they all listen to him read his poetry. Apparently they all collectively agree that it's awful, and then Titus leaves, and then he eventually gets on a boat, and then he sees Mervyn Peake there with his family, and now Mervyn Peake seems to be happy. And that's how the book ends. The portly guy who dresses in style, I'm almost 100% positive that that is supposed to be Truman Capote, and I looked high and low across the internet. I could not find any indication that Mervyn Peake or Truman Capote had ever met, or if Maeve Gilmore and Truman Capote had met. I'm wondering if Maeve Gilmore, if this was just like an inside joke for her, if Mervyn Peake may have read some of Truman Capote's early works and said, wow, this is awful. I don't know. That is 100% speculation, but all of the evidence here, when this character was being described, in my mind, I thought, that's Truman Capote, isn't it? Because Truman Capote kind of had a little bit of a high-pitched voice, and I know nothing about Truman Capote. I remember in 8th grade reading a little bit of one of his stories, but I just have this idea in mind that Truman Capote was kind of like snobbish and arrogant, and I don't know. Maybe he was the nicest man in the world, but all of this made me think, are they stealthily making Truman Capote a villain in this book? I don't know. Maybe I'm way, way, way off the mark here. But about 5 pages before the end of this book, I was thinking, how in the world are they going to end this? Because Titus is being consistently characterized now across this book and in Titus alone as someone who is constantly going to be on the move. He's never going to settle down. So how do you end it? Do you just end it by him saying like, well, I'm going to go somewhere else now? And I will say they do end it in a pretty okay way where he joins up with the artist and his family, and then everything is okay. It kind of has a nice, sweet, happy ending. I will say, before reading this, or actually over halfway into reading this, I thought to myself, Titus alone actually had a pretty good ending for the character of Titus Groan. He thinks about going back to Gormenghast. He sees the castle. He realizes, I'm not crazy. It does exist. I'm not going back. I'm going to go make my life somewhere else. And I felt like that was a pretty solid ending for the character, especially, like I said, when I consider that Mervyn Peake was maybe putting a little bit of his own experience with the early parts of him dealing with dementia into the story. I felt like it had a nice, kind of bittersweet, poetic ending. And then I realized, as I was reading this, I don't really want to see what happens next after Titus Alone. I actually bought this before I bought the collection of the other trilogy. I bought it knowing that I wanted to read this trilogy someday, and I actually thought this was going to be less of a story than what it was, because I had heard somewhere that in the Gormenghast Omnibus that there is collected various notes that Mervyn Peake had made about what he would have done with future books if he had written them. I don't know what that is, because my copy of the Gormenghast trilogy, which is up there on that shelf up there, it does not have any notes by Mervyn Peake. And so then I thought, well, maybe it's going to be in this book. No, this book is just a narrative, mostly written by Maeve Gilmore. Even though it says here, Maeve Gilmore, based on a fragment by Mervyn Peake. It is about 5 pages by Mervyn Peake. There's a quick little 2-page bit that shows Dr. Prunesqualler talking with Lady Gertrude at Gormenghast. And if you have not read the Gormenghast trilogy, that is going to be extremely confusing to you. But then there's like a very brief little bit where Titus is descending Gormenghast Mountain. So it picks up right where Titus Alone left off, where he sees the castle, and then he goes and he's going to go on another adventure, and then it picks up with that. And this does not have Mervyn Peake's original notes that I thought it would have, and I kind of wish it did, with how short this is, especially compared to the complete trilogy that I have. I don't think it would have hurt to have added like 20 pages of Mervyn Peake's original notes, and this does, in the foreword by Brian Sibley, it does talk about how Mervyn Peake had very sparse notes, where it would say like snow, or island, or military, or something like that, which were just basic, very, very general ideas of what he might, an adventure that he would throw Titus into in later stories. And then Maeve Gilmore took those very basic ideas and then wrote some stories about them. And like I said, with Titus Alone, you have 2 stories that, and I can't remember if I had finished this point or not, but you have 2 stories that kind of tie together at the end. With this book, none of it ties together at the end. You have his story where he meets the artist and he shacks up with her for a little bit and then he leaves. And then you don't see or hear any of that again. The only thing that counts as a running thread at any point in the book is the artist shows up a few different times. I forgot at one point Titus is living with some people, they're basically like monks, but the artist shows up a few times towards the end, but mostly all these adventures, you could kind of put them just about in any order, and you could still read the book the same. I don't like that. I realized the problem I was having was the only thing that connects all of this is Titus himself, and I've come to not really like Titus. He's a little bit of a scoundrel. He knocks this girl up, and then he says, well, I guess I'm going to leave. It's not my fault. I can't help that I don't want to stay in one place for too long. And wow, Titus, you're kind of a scumbag. And then once you get done with a particular adventure, if you have grown attached to that adventure, then you have to start all over from square one on getting attached to what you're reading. So for me, my favorite part was when he was with the artist Ruth, and he was living with her, and then at one point he's going to be a model for this guy who wants to paint a mural for this older woman. That was my favorite part of the story. And then once you realize, oh, Titus is leaving them, he's not going back, then I say to myself, it's going to be a real chore getting into this next story, because now I'm going to have to get attached to a bunch of new characters that I am going to have to try and fall in love with again after I've already fallen in love with these characters that you're getting rid of. And that wasn't really a problem with the previous Titus stories written by Mervyn Peake. Even in Titus Alone, where Titus is on the run, and he's, moving away from this other adventure, all the characters that you meet and fall in love with in the first half of that story, they do come back into play. And so I didn't really, overall, I didn't like this story. If you liked the first 2 Titus stories, Titus Grown and Gormenghast, really, I still kind of waffle on if I want to say that Titus Grown is actually a Titus story, since he's an infant throughout that whole book. But if you like those stories, and then you didn't like Titus Alone, I'm almost certain you wouldn't like Titus Awakes. But if you read the trilogy and then you're curious, well, what else is Titus getting into, you might like this. You might see this as a nice, bittersweet closure to the character, since you know that Mervyn Peake wanted to do more stories and never was able to get around to it. This is one of those things, I don't regret reading it, but I can't say that I actually liked reading this. I did like the earlier installments better. I didn't like this as much as Titus Alone, and that's a story that a lot of people don't like. And so, if I can't recommend this like I could recommend Titus Alone, then I'm not sure if anyone would actually really want to read this. And I hate that I'm saying that, because like I said, Maeve Gilmore had no intention of publishing this. So it feels kind of voyeuristic for me to look at this from my pedestal and say, this isn't good, this isn't good, this isn't good, when she was probably just trying to get this out of her system following just a couple years after the death of her husband. So those are my very scattered thoughts on Titus Awakes. I hope that you guys liked this video, and I will be back in the future with something else. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Catch you later.